In 1942, the US government seized a bank on Wall Street. Its crime? Trading with Nazi Germany during wartime. One of its directors was Prescott Bush, grandfather of one future president and father of another. The money from that seized bank would later help build one of America's most powerful political dynasties. Welcome to Through the Ages, where we rip open history's darkest secrets. Today, we're investigating how the Bush family transformed from Nazi-linked financiers into America's most successful political dynasty. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our weekly explorations into history's forgotten moments. Of course, when you hear the name Bush, you likely picture presidential libraries, controversial wars in the Middle East, Texas ranches, and that awkward moment when George W. dodged a shoe in Baghdad. A classic American success story, but it depends on who you ask. And what a story it seems. 2 presidents, governors, senators, CIA directors. The Bush legacy gleams with electoral gold, reading like a political monopoly game where one family owns all the properties. Yet beneath this red, white, and blue triumph lies a foundation built on something far darker. Transactions so controversial that their exposure once threatened to topple everything. We're talking about seized bank accounts, federal investigations, and connections to the darkest chapter in human history. In the halls of American power, where political dynasties come and go like seasons, the Bush family stands as an enduring monument to wealth, influence, and remarkably, survival through scandal. With a combined fortune hovering around $400 to $500 million, this Connecticut to Texas clan has transformed from New England aristocrats into a political machine that produced 2 presidents, multiple governors, and enough corporate board members to fill a country club dining room. The dynasty's true architect was Prescott Sheldon Bush, born May 15, 1895, in Columbus, Ohio, a man whose Yale pedigree and Skull and Bones membership would set the template for generations of Bushmen to follow. Standing 6 feet 4 inches tall with an aristocratic bearing that commanded boardrooms, Prescott married Dorothy Walker in 1921, joining his destiny to one of Missouri's wealthiest banking families. His new father-in-law, George Herbert Walker, wasn't just any banker. He was president of W.A. Harriman and Company and would later give his name to a future president. By 1931, Prescott had become a managing partner at Brown Brothers Harriman, the most powerful private banking house in America. From their offices at 59 Wall Street, Prescott and his partners controlled a web of investments that stretched from American railroads to German steel. It was through this network that Prescott became one of 7 directors of a modestly-looking bank called Union Banking Corporation. On paper, UBC appeared to be just another investment vehicle serving European clients. In reality, it was the American banking arm for Fritz Thyssen, the German steel magnate who had bankrolled Adolf Hitler since 1923. Thyssen himself would later write a book with the chilling title, I Paid Hitler, detailing how he funded the Nazi Party's rise to power. Through UBC, millions of dollars flowed between Germany and America, even as Hitler's regime began its march toward war. Prescott's other business interests were equally entangled with Nazi Germany. The Silesian American Corporation, which he directed alongside his father-in-law, controlled valuable coal and zinc mines in Poland that would later use slave labor from concentration camps. July 1942 brought a devastating headline in the New York Herald Tribune that made Prescott Bush's blood run cold. Hitler's angel has $3 million in U.S. bank. The article revealed that Union Banking Corporation was holding Nazi money, possibly to be held for Nazi bigwigs. On October 20th, 1942, while American soldiers were preparing to fight Nazis in North Africa, federal agents walked into Union Banking Corporation and seized all assets. They found what government investigators called a U.S. holding company with German and Polish subsidiaries that was actively managing Nazi interests. The seizure order specifically named Prescott Bush as one of the directors whose shares were confiscated as being held for enemy nationals. In the dusty government files, one document stood out, a report confirming that Prescott's bank was linked to United Steelworks, which produced half the steel for the Nazi war machine. Yet somehow, this scandal that should have destroyed the Bush family would instead become the foundation of their incredible rise to power. After the war ended, federal authorities quietly returned the confiscated assets to their American shareholders, including Prescott Bush, along with a settlement of $1,500,000. This Nazi-tainted money, never publicly acknowledged by the family, would fund the Bush dynasty's rise from Wall Street to the White House. Prescott emerged from the scandal not as a pariah, but as a respected Connecticut businessman. By 1947, he had reinvented himself as Connecticut's Republican finance chairman, raising money for the party while carefully cultivating his image as a moderate progressive. When Senator Brian McMahon died suddenly in 1952, Prescott seized his chance, defeating future Connecticut Governor Abraham Ribicoff to claim the seat. In Washington, Prescott became President Dwight Eisenhower's loyal ally, serving on the powerful Banking and Currency Committee, the same institution that had once investigated his Nazi banking connections, with no one daring to mention his past. Meanwhile, Prescott was grooming his sons for greatness, particularly his second boy, George Herbert Walker Bush, born in Milton, Massachusetts on June 12, 1924. Young George had absorbed the family lessons: Yale, Skull and Bones, military service, then make your fortune before entering politics. In 1948, rejecting his father's Wall Street path, George H.W. Bush packed his red Studebaker and drove to Odessa, Texas, to enter the oil business. Using family connections and Eastern money, including funds traced back to the Union banking settlement, George built Zapata Petroleum into a $1 million enterprise. By 1962, when Prescott retired from the Senate, he had successfully transformed the Bush name from Nazi-connected bankers to respected public servants. His parting gift to his son was a Rolodex of connections stretching from Texas oil fields to CIA headquarters, from corporate boardrooms to the highest levels of the Republican Party. The family even had a new origin story: not Wall Street financiers with uncomfortable German connections, but Texas oilmen and New England patriots. The phone call came at 1:45 in the afternoon on November 22, 1963, just 75 minutes after President Kennedy's motorcade was torn apart by gunfire in Dallas. George H.W. Bush, then a 39-year-old oil executive and Republican Party chairman, placed an urgent call to the FBI from Tyler, Texas, reporting a suspicious character who might be involved in the assassination. The call seemed oddly specific for a random tip. Bush named James Parrott, a harmless local Republican volunteer, as a potential threat to the president who was already dead. Years later, researchers would wonder why Bush felt compelled to establish his whereabouts with federal authorities on the day that changed America forever. Even more puzzling was Bush's claim that he couldn't remember where he was when Kennedy died, making him perhaps the only American of his generation with such convenient amnesia. Then, in 1985, journalist Joseph McBride uncovered a bombshell while researching in the National Archives. An FBI memo from J. Edgar Hoover himself, dated November 29, 1963. The memo stated that Mr. George Bush of the Central Intelligence Agency had been briefed about the reaction of anti-Castro Cuban exiles in Miami to Kennedy's assassination. When confronted with this document, Bush claimed it must refer to another George Bush, and the CIA produced a low-level researcher named George William Bush, who denied any knowledge of such a briefing. By January 1976, when President Gerald Ford nominated Bush to become Director of Central Intelligence, the CIA was drowning in scandal. The Church Committee had exposed assassination plots, illegal domestic spying, and covert operations that shocked even hardened Washington insiders. Senator Frank Church immediately opposed Bush's nomination, calling him a partisan political operative who would politicize the agency at its most vulnerable moment. Bush was, in fact, the first openly political figure ever nominated to run the CIA. Then, on December 23rd, just as Bush's nomination hung by a thread, CIA Station Chief Richard Welch was assassinated in Athens, Greece. The White House and CIA immediately blamed congressional investigations for Welch's death, though there was zero evidence linking the Church Committee's work to his murder. Suddenly, opposing Bush meant opposing the CIA itself, and enough Democrats buckled to confirm him on January 30th, 1976. In just 1 year as director, Bush would forge relationships and gather secrets that would serve him for the next 4 decades of his political rise. On Christmas Eve 1992, just weeks before leaving the White House in defeat, George H.W. Bush committed the final act of a conspiracy that began in 1986. With the stroke of his presidential pen, Bush pardoned 6 men convicted in the Iran-Contra scandal, including former Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger, whose trial was set to begin in 12 days. Weinberger's private notebooks contained damning evidence of Bush's deep involvement in illegally selling weapons to Iran and funneling the profits to Nicaraguan death squads. Independent counsel Lawrence Walsh exploded with rage, declaring that the Iran-Contra cover-up, which has continued for more than 6 years, has now been completed. Despite losing to Bill Clinton in 1992, the Bush dynasty was far from finished. 8 years later, Prescott's grandson, George Walker Bush, stood on the precipice of the presidency, locked in the tightest election in American history against Vice President Al Gore. On election night, November 7th, 2000, the networks called Florida for Gore, then for Bush, then declared it too close to call. When the dust settled, Bush led by just 537 votes out of nearly 6 million cast in Florida, a margin that triggered automatic recounts and lawsuits. The battle reached the Supreme Court, where 5 conservative justices, including 2 appointed by Bush's father, voted to stop the Florida recount on December 12th. In Bush versus Gore, the court's 5-4 decision effectively handed the presidency to George W. Bush, making him the first president since 1888 to lose the popular vote but win the office. With George W. Bush's inauguration on January 20th, 2001, the transformation was complete. From Prescott Bush's Nazi banking connections to 2 Bush presidencies spanning 12 years, the money that began in Union Banking Corporation's seized accounts had funded a political dynasty that reached the absolute pinnacle of American power. In 2003, 2 Holocaust survivors, Kurt Julius Goldstein and Peter Gingold, filed a class action lawsuit against the US government and the Bush family, seeking $40 billion in damages. They claimed the Bush family had profited from Auschwitz slave labor through Prescott Bush's business dealings. The case was dismissed by Judge Rosemary Collier on grounds of state sovereignty, ruling that the government couldn't be held liable. Jan Lissman, one of the lawyers for the survivors, noted that President Bush withdrew President Bill Clinton's signature from the treaty that founded the International Criminal Court, not only to protect Americans, but also to protect himself and his family. Prescott Bush was by no means unique, though his financial connections with the Third Reich were perhaps more intimate than most. Henry Ford was an avowed admirer of Hitler. General Motors and Ford played the predominant role in producing the military trucks that carried German troops across Europe. Standard Oil and Chase Bank, both controlled by the Rockefellers, invested heavily in Nazi Germany, as did many of Wall Street's leading brokerage houses. What makes the Bush case different is not just the financial connections, but how successfully the family buried this history while rising to unprecedented political heights. The transformation from Nazi-linked bankers to all-American political dynasty represents one of the most remarkable image makeovers in American history. The Bush family's journey from financial scandal to the White House also reveals something profound about American power, how wealth, connections, and institutional protection can overcome almost any obstacle. When George W. Bush stood at ground zero with a bullhorn after 9/11, few Americans knew that his grandfather's company had once been seized for trading with the enemy. When he launched the War on Terror, few connected it to his family's long history with the intelligence community. This historical amnesia wasn't accidental. It was the product of decades of careful image management, strategic political alliances, and the American tendency to look forward rather than backward. In 2018, when George H.W. Bush died, he was eulogized as a statesman, patriot, and devoted family man. The obituaries mentioned his military service, his time at the CIA, his presidency, and his post-presidential humanitarian work. Few mentioned Union Banking Corporation, Fritz Tyson, or the Trading with the Enemy Act. Today, the Bush name has largely recovered from the controversies of the George W. Bush presidency. Jeb's son, George P. Bush, serves as Texas Land Commissioner and is widely seen as the next generation of the family's political dynasty. The Bush family story reveals something profound about American power, that with enough money and connections, even the darkest origins can be transformed into the brightest future. That with enough time and strategic reinvention, even the most troubling histories can be forgotten. If you found this video interesting, make sure to click that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. We've got more forgotten moments in history coming your way every week. And if you have thoughts about the Bush family's rise to power, share them in the comments below. Our community loves discussing these historical mysteries together. This is Through the Ages, where history's darkest secrets come to light. Until next time.